Hello, everyone, and welcome for the Performance Assessments and Use webinar. Today, we have several presenters here to lead our discussion. My name is Carmen Arauz, and you can see my picture there at the top of the first column. Also with us today are my colleagues Emma Pellerin, Corey Hamilton-Villagas, and Jessica Bailey from REL Appalachia, as well as Ann Peterson from the Virginia Department of Education. We also want to introduce you to the real stars of today's webinar, Erin Lowery and Carrie Rube. Erin and Carrie are science teachers in Prince William County Public Schools. They are here today as our performance assessment implementation experts, and you'll hear about their experiences implementing performance assessments in science later in today's webinar. We also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge a few other individuals who have been instrumental in supporting this project. Beth McBride is an education researcher formerly with SRI who led parts of this project. Jennifer Powell is a science coordinator at Arlington County Public Schools, and Gina Townsend is a science coordinator at Prince William County Public Schools. Both Jennifer and Gina have been great supports to the teachers in their counties participating in this project and provided feedback on the materials you'll see today. We are very grateful for their participation. We're also very grateful to have all of you here today. It looks like we have mostly folks from Virginia, but maybe a few folks from our neighbors in Kentucky, so welcome to everyone. It looks like the majority of you are teachers, which is great. There's tons of information that you'll be able to practically apply in your classrooms this fall, so welcome to you all teachers. And then we also looks like we have a couple of state education folks and some other administrators, and welcome to you as well. I think there's something here for everybody. Also happy to see that we've got quite a mix of grade levels and content areas. So looks like most of everybody here, well, there's lots of 6th and 7th grader teachers, lots of our middle school teachers represented, but we also have folks from kindergarten all the way up to 10th grade, and even some folks using Spanish to teach science. So welcome to everybody and happy to have you all here. In terms of your experiences with rubrics, which is one of the key topics of today's webinar, it looks like most of you have at least some experience using rubrics to assess and engage students. So I think that's great that you'll be able to use some of that experience to help you in your classrooms along with the content that's presented in today's webinar. So thank you all again for being here. Today's webinar is part of a two-part series on implementing high-quality performance assessments in science. The webinars are a culminating event for an 18-month-long coaching project that REL AP staff started with Virginia teachers in the fall of 2019. During these webinars, our goal is to leverage the work from the coaching project to increase understanding amongst a larger audience of research and strategies for implementing high-quality performance assessments, which improves student mastery of Virginia science standards of learning. Our first webinar in the series focused on selecting and enhancing a performance assessment. Today's webinar targets the effective use of performance assessments in science classrooms, focusing on assessment administration and student engagement. A recording of this and the first webinar will be available on the REL Appalachia website. Now that we've done our introductions, we're going to start off today's webinar with a quick recap of the project and introduction to performance assessments, and then we'll hear from our implementation experts with an overview of the performance assessment administrations from this last fall. Next, we'll take a closer look at the four-step process our teachers follow to implement their performance assessments and the different types of rubrics you can use in your administration to engage students. We'll also hear from the Virginia Department of Education on the common rubrics available to support teachers' performance assessment administration and how to use rubrics for effective feedback. The goals for today's webinar are to identify and review the implementation process for performance assessments and to understand the importance of student engagement in administering performance assessments. We'll identify the different types, features, and functions of grading rubrics used with performance assessments, provide support for using the Virginia Common Rubric when implementing a performance assessment, and finally, we'll share resources and recommendations for administering performance assessments in distance learning environments. I'm going to turn it over to Corey Hamilton-Biagas and Jessica Bailey, who will share an overview of performance assessments and more on the project background.
Okay, thank you, Corey. This is Jessica. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. To start us off, I just want to clarify what we mean when we refer to performance assessment and performance tasks. So sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but in this webinar, we make a distinction between the two terms. A performance assessment refers to the entire assessment, which might include several performance tasks. It also includes teacher instructions, the rubric, and materials, including, of course, the performance task. The performance task is the individual activity or piece of work that a student will complete. That will include the prompt to the student and the directions. Okay, so hopefully that's clear when we are talking about those two terms. The performance assessment is everything. The performance task is really what the students are going to be prompted to do. So there's several benefits of performance assessment and also many things to consider. We discussed these at our webinar last week, but I'll just do a quick recap. So many of the benefits include that the performance assessments allow you to assess complex standards and skills in ways that traditional assessments don't allow you to do. These types of assessments can be very engaging for students, which we'll talk about today. They can support lots of personalization opportunities and provide authentic experiences for students to demonstrate their learning. And they also provide formative and or summative feedback both for you as a teacher and the student. Some of the factors to consider, though, are that they may take extra time to either create or administer. They do require significant teacher preparation, and they can be time-consuming to score or evaluate the student performance. When you're thinking about using performance assessments in a distance learning environment, you definitely can do so. For example, you could ask students to send regular updates on their progress. That could be through email or one-on-one video conferencing calls, or even asking students to take pictures of their projects in different phases to mark their progress. And you could also, you may prefer using performance assessments in a distance learning environment. You could ask a student to perform an activity in real time over video conferencing platform to ensure that the students are not relying on class materials or readings to answer assessment questions, especially if this is a concern of yours. And when teachers send a summative assessment to students, even with the expectation that students will complete the assessment in a specific amount of time, you might be unaware of what materials, if any, students are relying on to complete the assessment. So being able to do it in real time over video is certainly a way that you could use performance assessment in this environment. I'm going to turn it over to Corey to talk a little bit more about what we've been doing on this project.
Thank you, Jess. Throughout the REL Appalachia Performance Assessment and Science Project, teachers have shared their experiences and input while implementing performance assessments and using the Virginia Quality Criteria Review Tool for performance assessments, which we will refer to as the criteria tool from here on out. This feedback has informed the supports provided to teachers throughout the project and are included in the materials we will share with you during today's webinar. All of the resources developed for the project are included in the Implementing High Quality Performance Assessments in Science workbook. The workbook is also part of today's materials. All materials from today's webinar can be accessed on the REL AP website and used independently as a resource when planning and implementing performance assessments. The link to the project page and related resources will be available at the end of the webinar on the resources slide. Through working with teachers on the performance assessment project, REL AP staff developed this 4-step process for identifying and using performance assessments. The process was created with input from teachers, is consistent with research on performance assessment, and grounded in using the criteria tool. More information on these steps can be found in the participant workbook. So in Webinar 1, we covered steps 1 through 3 in identifying and implementing performance assessment. Let's do a quick recap of each. Step 1. Teachers define the purpose of the assessment and consider the standards and intended learning outcomes they want to measure. Step 2. Select a performance assessment that meets the purpose and standards identified in Step 1. Many teachers may already engage in these first two steps as a natural part of their planning process. Our experience suggests that it is helpful to be intentional about determining and documenting the purpose of performance assessments early in the planning process. This type of pre-work can help both new and experienced teachers organize their thinking and assist with implementing a high-quality performance assessment. Step 3. Teachers focus on applying the criteria tool and the information in it on how to use the tool to assess and enhance performance assessments to ensure that they are aligned with instructional goals. Today, we will concentrate on Step 4, focusing on how to engage students and how to plan for administration. Let's dive in by hearing from our implementation experts on performance assessments they implemented last fall. Now, Carmen will introduce our implementation experts, and they will share examples from their classrooms. Carmen?
That mute button. Thanks, Corey. First, we're going to hear from Carrie Roop. And as I mentioned earlier, Carrie is a 5th grade teacher and a science lead at Bel Air Elementary at Prince William County Schools. Carrie is going to share her experiences administering a performance assessment titled Science for Oceanography. Take it away, Carrie.
Thank you, Carmen. The assessment that I gave to my science 5th grade classroom was based on information that we had learned about oceanography. I had 22 students in my classroom made up of levels 1s, 3s, 6s of ELL students. I also had special education students in my classroom for the science period when I created this assessment. In Virginia, teachers use the Access for ELL's assessment, which is based on the WIDA's ELP performance definitions to determine English proficiency levels and to track English language development, progress, and proficiency. So I had to look at all this information when I was doing this assessment for my kiddos. So I also had the assessment typed up in Spanish for my ELL level 1 student because I wanted to make sure that my student understood the project in his own home language. The students in my classroom were asked to create a model of the ocean features within a shoebox using the information from their study of the unit. The model was to be 3-dimensional and could be made out of recyclable materials. I had a table full of materials that the students could use for their projects. I wanted a creative way to assess my students' learning to see how they understood the science vocabulary for the unit on oceanography. So I was assessing SOL 5.6 oceanography, and then I also put in there SOL 5.1 on communication because students, I wanted to make sure that they had a chance to explain their understanding. So we also invited 3rd and 4th grade students from other classrooms into our classroom for them to talk about it. Students had 5 days to complete their performance task. One thing that went very well for me was the student gallery walk and presentation after the students built the 3D models. I was very excited to see that my level 1 ELL student was speaking in his native language and describing the model to other students who also spoke Spanish. So he was giving that information to them and their eyes just lit up in the classroom. I wish that I had gotten a little bit more of my 5th grade colleagues to join me on this project with their own students because Erin is going to talk about her experience with her team. I would add an SOL objective for the writing portion on the assignment and the assessment just to see how they would do with the writing piece. And I also would add one more day to the project because of the sharing piece. I engaged my students with their project by talking with them during the unit about their project and telling them that they could get to use their creativity to show their knowledge. The students built fish out of clay and were asking if they could bring in other materials to use. You know, we could spend a little bit more time discussing the lessons learned, just a bit, on this project, so I would give about maybe 7 days instead of 5. Back to you, Carmen.
Thanks so much, Carrie. It was really interesting to hear, you know, about you reflecting on your assessment, as well as much as it was seeing you and hearing you implement it in practice. So now we're going to hear from Erin, and Erin is a teacher at Fred Lynn Middle School in Prince William County, and her performance assessment was on the impact of the human impact on watersheds. Go for it, Erin.
Thanks, Carmen. So like Carmen said, my PBA was on human impact on watersheds. So the objective of this assessment was to have students take what they'd learned about watersheds so far and make concrete connections to the impact humans have on watersheds. So up to this point, they had learned what watersheds are and the geography of a watershed system. They understood that tributaries and rivers generally run downstream towards larger bodies of water, like lakes and watersheds and oceans. They had already learned that there are many different ecosystems that live within a watershed system, and that water carries and moves massive amounts of earth. And I chose to implement this at the end because they needed that information to help them make connections. So then the students would have the solid understanding of how a watershed system works to make the connections to the consequences of human impact on watersheds. To get them hooked, we did a gallery walk. You'll see it in a video here in a little while. I had 97 sixth graders perform this assessment. Many of them were English language learners and special education students. And I also had Signet, which is our gifted program. I was really intentional in how I grouped my students. What I really like about performance assessments is it allows a lot of student voice, and I gave them voice in who they were grouped with as well. I gave them a Post-it. They had to write down 3 names, and I tried to match them with at least one of those names while being very thoughtful of where I put my SPED and my ESOL students. And I think the grouping made a huge impact in the engagement and the quality of the end product. And then just to make it more authentic and relevant, we focused on littering that was happening in and around the school. And we discussed the impact of the littering on our waterways, which lead to the local watershed. And they were tasked with creating a potential solution to the littering problem and then pitching it to our school staff and our administration. I think next year, or this year, getting ready to roll out, what I want to do differently is I'd like to create checklists for my students to continually refer to. I wanted to create a timeline that can be displayed. In this case, it will have to be displayed virtually, just so that they have an idea of where they should be by a certain amount of time. This assessment, I gave them 3.5 weeks. And while most of them were able to get there in the end, I did have a few that lagged behind. I'd like to make sure next time, although I felt like I did okay with it, I think I could have done a little bit better with absolute clarity about what I was asking them for. For example, I wanted my students to provide solutions to the littering problem at school. But some of my kids took it even bigger than that and wanted to solve all the littering and trash problems within the oceans rather than down in just in the local watershed. I wanted to create peer review rubrics for each category on the master rubric so that groups can grade other groups' projects and give feedback that way. I did create an example PowerPoint to give my students some kind of direction, but I think next time I would like to make more examples of different types of products that they could create. And then I think I'd also like the opportunity to take my students to, or at least show them a recording of a live town hall style meeting so students can see how people create and pitch their ideas for change in their community. And I'd like to do it for several reasons, which include wanting them to see what a proposal looks like and the work that goes into creating one, and the idea of pitching it to a larger audience. But more importantly, I want my students to know they have a voice in their community and how to use that voice in a positive way. Things that went really well for me, I was very surprised at their enthusiasm for the topic. But then again, when you make it relevant to them, they're more likely to buy into it and put forth their best effort. I was blown away by their willingness to embrace a new type of project and how well they worked together. To include making sure that the special education students and my ELs were included in the group as well. My students embraced technology to enhance their pitches. A lot of my kids worked with our ITC and the green screen and created videos they embedded in their presentations. Unit test scores at the end of the unit were very surprising in the best kind of way, particularly with my special education and my ESOL students. My level 1s and 2s were allowed to work and present in their native language, which made everyone feel included and produce quality work in the end. I just had an ESOL teacher translate for me. I was able to integrate the 5 C's of the profile of a graduate, and I was also able to integrate content area, the language arts standards. And that's it. Carmen, back to you.
Great. I think those were wonderful examples to hear from, and there's so much richness in the things that you shared about what you saw in your classrooms. I think one thing that stood out for me was the enthusiasm for your students. And so I'd like to hear from the audience. What questions do you all have, or what comments do you all have for implementation experts on their experiences with performance assessments? Again, for me, what stood out was that enthusiasm from the students that I heard from both of you, and the way that you were able to see that enthusiasm in different ways. I also thought that it was interesting that you both were able to use your performance assessments to address different learning levels, especially with your EL students, and that you were able to differentiate with them for them in a way that was accessible and authentic to both what you were doing as well as to the discipline. So I think that was really interesting. And the other thing that I thought that was that I saw in common in both of your presentations, and I'm wondering if anybody has questions on or would like to ask, and please feel free to share in the chat if you do have questions. But just the work that went in on behalf of your students, or the work that your students put in to share what they learned, right? Those presentations that you had your students do at the end, Erin, where they're talking and showing what they learned and being able to express that in a different format than what they might typically be able to do in a traditional assessment, I think was really eye-opening. You shared some of those videos of them presenting with our team, and we enjoyed them thoroughly. I think and similarly with Carrie, and being able to put together a 3D representation of what they learned was also just a different way for them to show their learning and to use different formats and different technologies to do that. I think is one of the benefits of performance assessments. So I am wondering if there are folks in the chat that have questions. I see folks typing, but I don't see any actual questions. And we can certainly, take questions at the end, but I'd love to hear from the audience if you all have thoughts or ideas that you'd like to, run by our implementation experts. I think one of the benefits of having them in the room today is that they have that real-world classroom experience that they can share as you are thinking about implementing performance assessments in your classroom. So it looks like we do have one comment. Performance assessments are fair, valid, and authentic, especially for SPED and ESOL students whose understanding is not evidenced in standardized assessments. Agreed. That's absolutely true. I think part of what we saw in our classroom in the classroom with our implementation experts. Shakir saying, no questions, but I do want to say kudos for allowing students to present in their native language. Agreed. I think that was also very, very innovative and a great approach. And so, Erin, I don't know if you want to comment any more on that or what led you to take that approach. I think, Carrie, you did something similar with your performance assessment as well.
It's Erin. I'm sorry, Carmen, you were asking me about the native language comment?
Yeah, I just want to, if maybe you could share a little bit more about what drew you to allow students to present in their native language, and what was the thought process there?
Among my 97 students, I had quite a handful that were WIDA level 3 or below, and so I struggled for a while in the planning process to figure out how would I make them feel comfortable doing a project like this? How will I make sure they feel included? And then I wanted to make sure they felt confident as well. And after talking to my 6th grade ESOL teachers and with my team, the conclusion we came up with was allowing them to do it in their native language. Now, luckily, all of my L students spoke Spanish, so I didn't have to contend with another language on top of that, so it was easy for translation as well.
Great, great. So it looks like we have a question from Eric. Eric says, it's helpful to learn that PBAs can be effective when they're shorter days, like Carrie's, and longer, like Erin's, that take weeks. I'm curious if they're weighted accordingly. Do either of you have any thoughts on whether you would weigh your assessments differently depending on how long you implemented?
I don't know that the time we give them to do it really, really kind of makes a difference. I gave mine the length of time that I did because it was new all around, both for me as the instructor and for my students. And I gave them a wide berth in terms of the products that they could create, so I wanted to give them the time to do that as well. And then timing in terms of when I implemented it landed with winter break happening right smack in the middle of it. And so I needed to give them a little bit of time when they came back off of that winter break to get back into it. Had I planned that out a little bit differently, I probably wouldn't have gone as long as 3.5 weeks. But I don't think it really affects how we weight the project.
Right.
Sorry, Carrie.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree with Erin. I didn't take time into consideration for the grading. With my rubric, they actually had a spot where they graded themselves, 4, 3, 2, 1, and they knew the expectations when we had talked about it as a class. So I found out that for their own rubrics, they actually graded themselves a little bit harder than when I graded them. So that was one of those, oh, okay. But no, time for me was not an aspect. I didn't look at that for part of their grading.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are other considerations in terms of time, such as, practical things like what your school calendar looks like, or, how much time you have to devote to it. So I just want to take one more question because we want to wrap up this section. But it's Luz Dari, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and apologies if I'm not, asked, how would you do the Watershed project virtually? Would you break them up into groups and have them do research during class time?
Okay, so you're catching me right as I'm beginning to think about this as well. So if you have suggestions, put them in the chat. My thought process was that we'll do a virtual field trip of the local waterways around where we are, so they still get the experience of seeing, even though it's just through the computer, the waterways in our area. The lessons will remain the same, but I would probably break them into groups and do breakout rooms to allow them to work together, and it would be during our synchronous time, more than likely. I'm not completely planned out on that yet, but that is the direction I'm going in.
Thanks, Erin. And I just want to just check the chat one more time to make sure that there's no other questions before we move on. And we'll also have time later on if you guys have additional questions that come up as we finish the presentation. But thank you so much for the conversation and for your ideas, Erin and Carrie, and for sharing with us your experiences. So I'm going to pass it on to Corey, Carrie, and Erin, who are going to share more about the four-step process that Corey mentioned earlier and how Carrie and Erin applied this step in their administration of the performance assessments.
Thank you, Carmen. Performance assessments provide a really great opportunity to capture students' interests and have them take more ownership of their learning, as we've heard from both Carrie and Erin just a couple of minutes ago. It will be important for you to consider how you will engage students throughout your planning process. Step 4 of the identifying and using performance assessment process helps with that task. Remember, students benefit from opportunities to be involved in their assessments, so students can be active participants in their own assessment, their learning, about how they will be evaluated and contributing to their own learning in terms of their strengths and challenges. We want students to feel engaged and fully connected to their own learning. Strategies for engaging students in assessment planning include online applications such as formative assessment with plans that are free for individual teachers that help instructors assign tasks to students, receive the results in real time, and provide immediate feedback in a virtual learning environment. Teachers can use this platform to track progress and keep students engaged in assessment planning. The student-led conferences allow students to reflect on and share their work for progress over a period of time with their parents or guardian and teacher. Self-assessment involves students reflecting on their own work, such as using a rubric or reflecting on their work by writing in a journal. In a distance learning environment, students can submit reflection videos in place of journal entries in applications like Seesaw. The process emphasizes the opportunity for students to identify high-quality work rather than simply provide a grade. Peer assessment involves students assessing the work of their peers against a set of assessment criteria. They can provide feedback to their peer as well as a score or grade. In a remote learning environment, teachers can utilize features on video conferencing platforms that allow meeting facilitators to create breakout groups for participants. Students can provide feedback to their peers through these small group discussions. Step 4 is a crucial part of the process because it emphasizes the need to engage students throughout the assessment process. In the clip we're about to see, our performance assessment implementation expert shares expectations for students at the start of the assessment. Before we watch this clip from the classroom, let's hear from Carrie on her experiences engaging students in her performance assessments. Carrie, tell us about the engagement strategy we are going to see in the clip and why you chose it. We'd also like to hear if you considered or implemented other strategies to engage students during your assessment. Carrie, would you share for us?
Thank you, Corey. Some of the strategies for engagement, I wanted to make sure that the students understood that I wanted them to be creative. So I gave them a multitude of items to choose from. They got to choose their own size box. They could bring whatever size box that they wanted to for the three-dimensional project. I I wanted them to choose their style for the assessment. You know, did they want to use clay figures? Did they want to make it out of paper? So they could draw their project ideas or they could write them. So in this clip, you're going to see them taking their ideas from their mind and actually putting it down on paper, either writing or drawing it. And then I also wanted to make sure that they knew that they had enough time to do this. So they were asking other things like, could I, you know, Ms. Roop, can you please go grab this for us? Or, can I bring this in from home? And I told them that that was fine. I wanted to make sure that they understood that this was their project, and I wanted them to take ownership of it.
Okay, let's watch this clip.
This is the last thing you're going to do is you're going to turn this back into me, and you're going to have your glows and grows. I'm really proud that I did this. I wish I had done it this way, okay? That way you can reflect upon your learning, and Ms. Roop can do the same thing. Yes, ma'am.
Is this after you like check mark?
This is after you do yourself in the student column, and you rate yourself here. Then Ms. Roop will rate you right here, and I'm going to read your comments, and then my comments will be at the bottom.
I love that example. Carrie, it would be really great to hear what you learned from using that strategy and what you would do differently if you used that strategy again.
Corey, some of the things that I loved about this strategy with their glows and grows and their creativity is they were harder on themselves than anything. I was like, oh my goodness, and the comments that they wrote, going, oh, this is what I would do next time. It was for me as a teacher, it was very eye-opening and going, you know, I love that my students are taking ownership of what their learning looks like. Some of the things that I would add, more time for students to work on their ideas, maybe another day. Also a round robin of getting the information to the students. When I presented in one session for 45 minutes, we went over the whole thing, and it's a long time for the kids to sit. So a round robin, if each group took a section, I think I'm going to do that for this year. And also I would add more items to choose from, clay being one of the biggest ones because they wanted to make fish out of clay, and then I had to buy little lanterns for them to put the fish. It was very cute. But from doing all this different engagement, I really learned a lot as a teacher.
That's so awesome. It's wonderful to hear when our kiddos move beyond the expectations that we set for them, right? We have really high expectations for their learning always, but when they're pushing themselves, it's just really rewarding to see them challenging each other and stretching each other. So thanks so much for sharing with us, Carrie. Classroom, so we're going to move right along here, talking about assessment planning. Classroom assessment practices require adequate preparation to obtain accurate information about student learning. If we want students to benefit from the assessment experience, both teachers and students must adequately prepare for the assessment. When we are planning for our assessment, the things that we should consider are things like time. Allow adequate time to develop assessments, prepare evaluation guidelines, provide feedback to students, and record and report on results. Also consider scheduling time to collaborate with colleagues if needed. In a distance learning environment, teachers can schedule individual check-in calls using video conferencing to provide students with uninterrupted time to assess their progress and provide feedback. Another consideration would be the assessment materials. Determine what assessment materials are necessary. For example, an assessment may require software, computer access, a performance venue, clay for fish creation, a recording device, or other kinds of art supplies. Also think about administration instructions. Develop administration's instructions for teachers and students. Ensure that the language is appropriate for the audience. Include the estimated amount of time that students will need to complete the assessment. Also include a plan for students who are absent or do not finish in the allotted time, or if there's an interruption in the testing somehow. Erin mentioned earlier how some of her students reached really big with the watershed idea, and they were trying to solve a world problem and not just a community problem. So having really clear instructions can help to ensure that they stay within the scope and scale. And then the evaluation materials. Develop evaluation criteria such as a rubric and determine how you will deliver feedback to students. Consider when the criteria will be provided to students, most often before the assessment, so that the students will know what the expectations are straight out of the gate. So planning to administer your assessment is critical. You will want to consider all the aspects of the assessment in planning your assessment, including how you will organize performance tasks and the specific prompts you will give students. In this next clip, we can see how effective planning for the performance task benefited administration and organization in the classroom. Before we watch this clip, let's hear from Erin on her experiences planning for administration of her performance assessment. Erin, tell us about how your planning helped to facilitate administration in the process we are going to see in the clip.
Thank you, Corey. I started planning the assessment about 3 weeks out before I introduced it to my students. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, I was still learning about how performance-based assessments worked. I want to make sure I was doing it properly. And I also wanted to include my team. And we planned over 3 weeks how we were going to do this. We discussed and worked out what was going to work for all of the students, not just mine. We determined how long we were going to give our students to work on it. We discussed what do we want from them, what kind of product, what are we hoping to get out of them by the end of it. And then we took the time to do what I like to call the administrative things. Reserving the technology carts for laptops, Kindles, and iPads, borrowing books from the library, and gathering materials and things like that. During our planning, we also created our PowerPoint model, and we went through what lessons and activities we were going to teach and how we could visualize how students might put that content into their assessments. And then we also sat and planned as a team to create the grading rubric. And I would like to say that the planning paid off. It's easier to adapt to the unexpected or the unknown when you've planned for everything else.
Let's take a look at this clip, see what we can learn from Erin.
When I tell you to go, you're going to get into your project groups. And hanging around the room are these pieces of paper that say water quality factors. And underneath it is a different category on each page. You've got construction, agriculture, cities and towns, residential. That one's industrial, so our factories. And then the one over here that we've not ever really talked about is wastewater treatment facilities. So where water goes when it's dirty and needs to be cleaned. And even though wastewater treatment provides a good service for us in cleaning our waters, there are byproducts and pollutants that come from doing that. So you're going to rotate through each picture, roughly about 2 minutes at each picture. You are looking at the pictures that are on there. You're looking at the little passages that are listed. One passage will talk about the different types of pollutions each category causes. The other passage is going to discuss potential solutions. What can we do to stop this from happening? I'm going to give each group a pad of Post-it notes, and you're going to go to each picture and you're going to write down one negative impact of each type, and then you're going to write down one of the solutions that are listed there as well. you're going to take that Post-it when you're done, when the timer goes off, and you're going to put it up here under the category of the picture that you were standing at. So if I'm standing at wastewater treatment, when that timer goes off, I'm going to bring my Post-it and I'm going to stick it under wastewater treatment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, and then you will move on to the next picture.
That was such a great example of the detail that went into the planning and ensuring that the students understood what was happening in terms of their instructions around the assessment. Erin, it would be great to hear from you about what you learned from planning ahead and what you would do differently next time.
I'm the kind of teacher that has nightmares about showing up to class and not having anything planned. And what am I going to do? So planning is a big deal to me, almost to the point of over-planning. I think because I put so much time into planning, not just the whole assessment, but the tasks that they did within the assessment, we were able to get through it relatively smoothly. Most of their questions to me were not so much centered around the expectation of what they were supposed to do, but can we do this? Can we do that? Can we use this type of technology? So that made me feel good about the level of planning as well. Next time, besides the things I'd already talked about earlier, like the checklists and peer review rubrics and things like that, I'd also like to try and add in another content area, probably social studies, and I would like to plan more time for peer assessment.
Yeah, those sound like really great ideas. I had the good fortune of being able to observe both Erin and Carrie while they were delivering these assessments, and you guys are able to see just a snapshot of the spectacular job that they did in engaging the students. The energy around the assessments was absolutely incredible. So I want to just say, great job. Thank you for sharing these examples and being willing to be a model for other teachers around the implementation of performance assessments in the classroom. Next, we will hear from Jessica Bailey on different types of rubrics that you can use in your performance assessment implementation. Jess?
Hey, thank you. So earlier in the webinar, we asked if you have experience with rubrics, and most of you said that you have some experience, and some, actually a good number of you had some extensive experience, and some of you had little experience. So I'm going to talk to you today about what rubrics are, how you can use them on your performance assessment. We're not going to get into the details of how you actually create a rubric, but if I can put a plug in for another tool that we've developed, the REL Northeast and Islands has just released an online course on how to create performance assessments, and we have a whole module that is full of resources on how to create rubrics. So I'll put a link to that in the chat soon, and if you need more information on how to actually create rubrics, that would be a good resource for you. Okay, so what is a rubric? Well, a rubric is more than just a scoring tool. It's an evaluation tool that communicates expectations for students on their performance on an assessment, and also provides focused feedback on a student's progress. So in a nutshell, it is used to assess students' performance along a criteria, but it really is more than that. It's a way to communicate your expectations and provide feedback to students. You've probably seen rubrics. You probably know that they look like a table, that you have rows and columns. The criteria in a rubric are the rows, and they include a description of each element of the assessment, and may also include performance samples that illustrate each of the levels of performance. So I'll give you an example in just a minute, but the levels of performance are your columns, and those levels are the degree to which the criterion has been met. So you are rating each of your criteria along the levels of performance. Your levels of performance are along a continuum. Okay. Feel free to add any questions that you might have in the chat, and I can answer those as we go back. Okay, so when you're using a rubric for any group of students, even your ELL students, you'll want to ensure that it reflects learning-centered design principles. So let's review the elements of a high-quality rubric. First, a rubric sets clear expectations for student performance. It focuses on what is present rather on just what is absent. And I see this all the time with rubrics, that they'll say students missed this content, or they omitted, X, Y, and Z. So rather than focusing on what is absent, if you set the expectation for what should be present, it's actually much more informative and helpful for the students so that they know what they're working toward. Okay, rubrics use a continuum of performance levels to provide feedback on the strengths and weaknesses of the student's performance or product. And high-quality rubrics have performance levels that are distinguishable from one another. So if you think about that continuum of performance, you might have exceeds expectations and also meets expectations, and those two columns should have language in them that is distinguishable from one another. Lastly, a high-quality rubric also provides meaningful feedback. It can be used for formative and or summative purposes. So you may be familiar that there are two types of rubrics. There are generalized rubrics and there are task-specific rubrics. Generalized rubrics are used to apply the same criteria to evaluate multiple assignments regardless of the content or the specific content. The value of a generalized rubric is that it presents students with clear and consistent criteria for each assignment. Think of a writing rubric that you could use across lots of different courses. So if the expectations are consistent across assessments, students can learn from their previous feedback and improve their performance as they move from one task to another similar task. On the other hand, task-specific rubrics are helpful when assessments require specialized performance criteria. So you can't use the same rubric across many different assessments. A task-specific rubric allows the teacher to clearly articulate the different criteria that they will identify the student's level of performance on a particular assessment. So both types of rubrics are helpful. They can help a student improve their performance. They can show the teacher's expectations, and the students can show how they meet those expectations. So let me show you an example of both. So this first example is a generalized rubric example. This rubric specifically addresses students' abilities to construct, use, and or present an oral and written scientific explanation supported by empirical evidence about a phenomenon. So the criteria are the three rows that we have going across the screen. There's a claim, evidence, and reasoning. The levels of performance are below, approaching, meeting, and exceeding. By using this generalized rubric, a teacher can provide consistent feedback on students' practice of constructing an explanation. They may be tasked with this on many different assignments or projects. Moving on to the task-specific rubric, this is an example from a middle school earth science course in which the teacher asks each student to develop a model to illustrate specific ways that Earth's tectonic plates interact. So it's really focused on the accuracy in which students' models identify the three types of tectonic plate boundaries and indicate the direction of movement to explain the different ways that the tectonic plates can interact with each other at their boundaries. This rubric focuses explicitly on a standard of learning that the teacher wants to assess. There may be other components to this rubric as well, besides accuracy, but this is just one piece that I'm showing you right now. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Ann Peterson at the Virginia Department of Education because there's several rubrics that she's going to present that might be of interest to you, and she'll talk about those rubrics and some other resources available to support science teachers in Virginia. Anne?
Hi, and good afternoon to you all. I am very excited, and the people at Department of Ed are very excited of the work that Erin and Carrie and teachers like them are doing to have kids engage in performance assessment and allow them multiple ways to show mastery of content in science and engineering practices. We do have, as I said, several different resources available, and one of these, or some of these resources, are common rubrics. So when Jessica was discussing the generalized rubric earlier, these are generalized rubrics that are aligned to the science and engineering practices. We have them for grades 3 through 5, both in scientific investigation and design challenges. We have a common rubric for grades 6 through 8, scientific investigation, and in grades 9 through 12. And when we look at these rubrics, you'll notice, well, first of all, if you don't have glasses, you probably should zoom in. This is a very tight page, but they are aligned to the 2018 Virginia Science Standards of Learning. We developed the Science Standards of Learning so that we can focus on kids engaging in the science and engineering practices. Since this was a focus of the standards, we designed the focus on the rubric to reflect this. The expectation is in sciences that students learn and develop these practices as they develop conceptual understanding of science topic. This rubric that is displayed is a grade 3 through 5 rubric and shows where students should be at the conclusion of 5th grade. This rubric shows all of the information. It is not require that any single task address all these different categories. Instead, this could be used throughout the year to assess students and where they're at. What I would expect is at the beginning of the year, the teacher team should sit down and say, okay, this is a grade 3 through 5 rubric. Where is the expectation of my 3rd graders perhaps to be at the end of 3rd grade? We do not expect them to be all at level 3 at the end of 3rd grade, since this is a 3rd through 5th grade rubric. But there needs to be a time to sit down, collaborate to determine what point level students in grade 3 through 5 should achieve by the conclusion of each school year. And again, it's unrealistic to expect students to obtain level 3 or 4 in 3rd grade. Instead, teachers may determine it to be appropriate for 3rd graders to earn a 3 in asking questions and defining problems, but only a 2 in planning and carrying out investigations. These discussions could also be a springboard for discussing assigning grades to student work. If students are expected to earn only a level 2 at the conclusion of 3rd grade, then assigned grades should reflect this. Now, I will say, I know that things are a bit in turmoil right now with instruction, and that there has been a waiver in the state of Virginia for the SOLs for accountability purposes for this academic year. The test will be given, however, only to show growth for the next year, and the schools are not going to be held accountable. But the expectation that all 3rd graders engage in a performance assessment as part of a balanced assessment plan still holds, regardless of whether instruction is virtual or face-to-face. I think that performance assessment is an ideal way to have kids engage in the outdoors, engage in science, perhaps at home, and provide opportunities to show their mastery. So that being said, I'm going to pass this back off to Jessica.
Thanks, Anne. I'm sure you might get some questions in the chat. So we'll monitor the chat as we go along in case you have any questions for Anne about that new news that she shared. Okay. I am going to continue talking about rubrics for a few minutes. I want to talk about how you can use rubrics to gain effective feedback. So when you're using rubrics, it enables multiple evaluators or multiple teachers to apply the same criteria to evaluating assessments, which increases the reliability of scoring. So this would be useful if you have a common assessment that you're using across science classrooms in your school, or across even elementary classrooms, you might have an assessment that you've co-created with your peers, and you're all going to be using the same rubric, and that would be really great because you'll be able to norm on the rubric and have really reliable scoring on that. Rubrics can also be used to provide formative feedback for drafts of work before final submission is due. I'm not sure if any of you have tried that before, but that is a really great practice. I didn't say it explicitly before, but I should call it out. You'll definitely want to share a rubric with your students ahead of time to let them know what the expectations are. And I get the question a lot when I talk to teachers about this is, well, for my little kiddos, do I have to have a separate kid-friendly rubric rather than the rubric that I'd actually be used for evaluation of their work? And so the answer is, yes, if you think that that would be helpful. I know some of you mentioned that you're in kindergarten, and so you're teaching kindergarten and then some really little kids. You might think of a way to present the expectations in a clear way that, is with smiley faces or some other kind of more simplified manner. So hopefully it won't be adding too much work, and if it's not available, then, if you don't have time to do something like that, then that's okay too. But as much as possible, you want to be able to share the rubrics with your class ahead of time so that they know what the expectations are for their work, and then you can give them formative feedback along the way. We've also, I know that Erin has mentioned this many times throughout the webinar today, is that she really wishes that she had built in time for students to peer assess each other's work. That's a really great way to engage students in the process of assessment. And so if you can build that in too, to have the students use the rubric to peer assess one another, that's a great way for them to be familiar with the expectations and also to give feedback. So rubrics also allow teachers to help students understand more clearly and completely how the teacher evaluated their work or performance, and also help teachers authentically monitor a student's learning process. They're very chock full of information to help you understand how your student is progressing. Lastly, rubrics can help inform instructional practices by allowing teachers to modify future lessons based on the student's performance. And I'm sure, as we'll hear from our experts, they, I'm sure, have been modifying their future lessons based upon their student performance. So it's important to remember that student performance on an assessment should inform instruction, just like all assessment, all data that you're collecting on your students should be informing your instruction. And so rubrics can be a very valuable tool that allows you to do that. You may find that there's patterns in the data that suggest that you need to modify your instruction, revisit certain content that you taught that maybe the students didn't perform well on. It really depends on what you're seeing in the patterns that emerge across student performance using the rubric. Okay. So now we're going to turn to an example and where we'll see in the video clip students working with a rubric to provide a peer review. So as I mentioned before, there are many benefits of a peer review, including that the students become more familiar with the assessment and evaluation criteria, and students can increase their ability to use that peer feedback to improve their own performance. So we're going to turn it over to the video, and let's see what this looks like in practice.
So what you do is you go through the project and you highlight everything they don't have. So if you go to their research and it doesn't have the sites listed, you highlight that. But only the sites, you don't highlight the intents.
Okay, that's a quick one, but as you can see from the example, peer review with rubrics is one approach that you can use to effectively engage your students during the performance assessment. And now I'll turn it over to our implementation experts on other approaches that they use during their administration. So I'm going to ask our implementation experts, Carrie and Erin, to share some of their experiences using rubrics. And I want them to speak to both of the questions that you see here on the slide. So Carrie and Erin, can you please talk about what was challenging about using rubrics and what have you found beneficial about using rubrics? And we'd also love to hear from you in the chat. So if you'd like to put in a comment about your experience using rubrics, that would be great. Also, if you have any questions, we'll have time after to answer your questions, and both Carrie and Erin will be able to answer some of those as well. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Carrie and Erin.
Thanks, Jessica. It's Erin. Some of the challenges with using rubrics. Well, the very first challenge I had was that I didn't have one, so I had to create one. And that's no easy task, especially when you're considering that it has to be written in student-friendly language, but you still want to get your point across. Challenges with rubrics in general, though, some rubrics can be written with vague or subjective language that's open to interpretation. And so if you were to approach this as a team like I did with mine, how I grade a student, my interpretation of language on a rubric might be different than my teammates. But conversely, some rubrics can be nitpicky, a little too detailed in the language, leaving absolutely zero room for interpretation. Writing rubrics isn't always easy. It takes a lot of time. And not all students are familiar with rubrics. And so then you have the added step of teaching students how to use one and the purpose behind using one. Some of the benefits, when a rubric is written clearly in kid-friendly language and it's thoroughly explained, rubrics give students a reference point, something to continually come back to make sure students understand what's needed to score well. It allows for feedback to students quicker and more personalized. And it also allows students to develop critical thinking through reflection of their scores and reading through any comments. And to a certain degree, allows equity in grading. With a rubric, there's clear guidelines for grading, and it hopefully removes any kind of bias, whether you realize you have it or not.
Wow, I hate to follow Erin from that. She covered everything. Some of the challenges when I was making my rubric for my assessment was there wasn't one. So I was working by myself, so trying to get that feedback, and I was so glad that I had Jess and Carmen that I sent my rubric to, and I went, hey, what do you guys think about this? So one thing that I would look for is someone to bounce the ideas off of for the rubric to make sure that if you're thinking it your way, making sure it's really student friendly. And that's one of the things that they would give me ideas back, Jess and Carmen, and I would be like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So maybe, working in a group of your teachers trying to come up with a rubric that's kid friendly, that they're understanding, and that they're also understanding yourself. Some of the things that were very helpful was the rubrics were very helpful for the kids to understand this is what my expectations are. This is what I'm trying to get from this project. I had my students rate themselves. They gave reasons why they chose that 4-3-2-1, and they were very specific in that. So that was a good learning opportunity for me to see it through their eyes. And I also had some comment on, well, I didn't know if it was really a 3 or a 4 because there wasn't a lot of difference. So that made me as the teacher go, oh, that's what I need to do now. I need to go back and revamp that so it's a little bit more clear for them. I found that the students were harder on themselves on the rubrics. They added a lot of detail and descriptions, and the parents really liked the rubrics that were sent home. And they gave feedback on the rubrics, and it started conversations between the parents and students about, okay, well, why did you rate yourself this way and not this way? What would you do different? And I got feedback from my parents saying, thank you very much for using these rubrics. because it really showed me what my child was understanding.
That's great, Carrie and Erin. Thank you for that feedback. And it looks like we are getting lots of questions in the chat and lots of comments there, so that's great. So please keep that coming. We still have time to discuss your comments and questions. And just to build off of what Carrie was just saying, it was very nice to be able to have some dialogue back and forth. We had a couple of calls where Carmen and I provided some feedback to Carrie on her rubric. And Carrie, for not having a rubric, you did a fantastic job for not having one off the bat. But just, I guess, another key point is to remember that you don't have to start from scratch. So Anne went over some examples, and even if you're not in Virginia, I'm sure that you could adapt the common rubrics that Anne mentioned and provided, that you could adapt those to your assessments in your state, or to whatever particular context that you have in your class. So you don't have to start from scratch. Let's see what we have in the chat here. So we've been having a little bit of dialogue about working with young students and how do you provide the expectations to them? How would you show them the rubric? And so, we've been talking about how you might use pictures or smiley faces. I also just put in the chat that you might also want to share samples of student work. And if you have, an assessment in kindergarten, I'm trying to think of what my kindergartner did 2 years ago. I'm trying to think if he was doing some literacy assessment, and you might be able to show the child that, okay, my expectation is that you can read 10 of these words on this page, and then that way they have, an expectation, or if there was a product that they created, that you could show them a product from your previous class, the previous year. And so sometimes that's helpful. Let's see. Sharing rubrics with parents is a great idea. Okay. We also had someone ask about, would you use a modified version for students who have, of a rubric for students who have IEPs? I think that really depends on what the assessment is. I'm not sure if Anne, would you want to speak to that? Do you have any thoughts on that, Anne?
Yeah, I was actually just trying to type in the chat, but I got behind. I have found that when I have given performance assessments to my classes, that the kids that traditionally don't do well on a multiple choice test or a standard type of assessment actually flourish on performance assessments. So as clearly as you can, if you vocalize what the expectations are, I find that many times, as educators, we try to lower expectation for these students, and they're going to outperform. You will not. I remember in my AP chemistry class, I had my students competing against a nurse science class with a co-taught class, and the co-taught class beat my AP class on a design challenge, and my students were floored. That's not fair. And you'll find that giving kids an alternative way to express mastery, you will be surprised at the level of performance they can display, and also maybe the lack of adaptation you may need. You may need to offer a little more facilitation during the process. You may have to do maybe some explanation, some of the rubric. But I think that, again, give it a try, because I think that the lowering of expectations or the changing of expectation isn't warranted a lot of times.
Thank you, Anne.
This is Corey. I wanted to chime in on this also to say that you may want to make an adjustment in terms of not the rubric expectations, but the steps that you take to help the student scaffold up to what we have in the rubric. So having appropriate accommodations or modifications based on the 504 IEP, but still holding them to that level of expectation that the rubric provides scaffolding for them appropriately so that they're able to meet that expectation.
Wonderful point, Corey. I couldn't agree more.
Hey, Jess, it's Erin. Can I weigh in on this too?
Please. Yes, please.
I have to agree with what Ann said about not wanting to lower expectations for our 504 and our IEP students. That's why the planning process is so important, and I'll go back to the statement I made last week that knowing your students is so important, especially when it comes down to stuff like this, knowing how to meet the accommodations of your 504s and your IEPs without lowering expectations. That's why it's also important to give a lot of thought to where you place those students in groups as well, because we all know that certain students jive better with others and are able to communicate better with certain students over others. And I have to also agree with Ann that performance assessments give our students a voice and choice in how they show us their mastery, and so they're almost by default going to outperform themselves on as compared to a paper pencil computer test. That's all.
And to me, this is Ann again, I think it's funny, the kids that have the hardest time at times are your gifted kids who just want to know what exactly do I need to do to get an A. And I find that their frustration level is sometimes higher than those that you would traditionally think may perform at a lower level.
Yeah, great. Okay. Great. So we had lots of comments in there. I know, Kai, you're still talking about how it's sometimes difficult to grade projects that students complete in young grades because oftentimes it's the parents' work, not the students. I feel for you as a parent myself, doing distance learning this past year, it was a struggle to see my child struggle and not be able to interfere and help him. So I can understand why parents do end up engaging, which takes away from what the student, the teacher, can infer about the student. I guess my advice is just to reiterate and communicate again and again to the parents, you know, what you need their involvement on and what you really don't want their involvement on, and hopefully no one will take offense.
Hold on, sorry, it's Erin. Can I make one more comment? Carrie and I were just talking about Kai's comment about in kindergarten the parents help a great deal, so how do we grade? I understand that how things work in the primary level are different from upper elementary, middle, and high school, but Carrie and I were just talking about too, and also putting the virtual learning aside. We did not allow our students to work on their performance assessments at home. It was only done at school specifically to avoid that problem. I don't know if that is ideal for kindergarten or not, but that might be a way around that problem, again, outside of virtual learning.
Great point. Yes. All right, so we are wrapping up. We're a little bit ahead of time, but I'm going to turn it back over to Carmen to close us out. Thank you all for your participation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again, everybody, for joining and for being with us today and for your participation in the discussion. It's very interesting to hear all of your different experiences. We just have a few closing items before we let you go, and so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emma to share those with you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I just wanted to point out that we have the stakeholder feedback survey link, and we would really appreciate it if you could complete it following the webinar. The link was just added to the chat, and you will be directed to the stakeholder feedback survey directly from this webinar once we close out. We're also happy to provide professional development certificates, and I've added Corey's email to the chat as well. So please email Corey Hamilton Viagas at SRI if you require documentation for professional development. You can find additional resources related to this project, including coaching materials and the full participant workbook on the REL Appalachia website, and you'll be able to access that link. Again, that's in the chat, and it's on the slide, which will be posted at the end within the next month on the REL Appalachia website. REL Northeast and Islands offers an online course for practitioners on creating and using performance assessments. It is currently available on their website, and I also uploaded the link to the chat a little bit earlier, and we'll be happy to send it out again following the webinar in an email to all registrants. And you can also check out the Virginia Department of Education's resource page for additional information and resources on performance assessments and local alternative assessments. A copy of this PowerPoint with the sources cited in the presentation will also be available on the REL AP website. And I'm getting some comments that the survey link